Hey, what's up, everybody? I am John Ricard. This is Camera Work Podcast. It's nice to be back. So today's topic is really about gear, which is really one of my favorite things to talk about because I think the gear actually matters a little more than most people say it does, or at least most professionals, because a lot of professionals like to say the gear really doesn't matter. And I think to some degree that's true. If you look at a guy like Jeremy Coward, one of my favorite photographers, if you go back a few years and you look at what he did with an iPhone in Haiti, you'll Google that, I'm sure you can find it, and you see some amazing work with an iPhone. It's like, it's better than my real work, and it's him shooting with a phone, and it might be better than your real work too, him shooting with a phone. So in that sense, the gear doesn't matter. But in another sense, the gear does matter, because for me at least, the gear does dictate a little, not dictate, but it has an influence on the way I shoot. If I use my Nikon, I kind of shoot one way. If I use my Leica, I shoot a little bit differently. So I think the gear, and if I'm using the wrong gear, I have a hard time producing the right results. So the gear does matter, but I've been on this like insane gear buying odyssey for the last month or so. It's really like out of control at the moment. So I figured I would talk about that a little bit on this week's episode. So it started like this. I got an opportunity to shoot a really good advertisement for a hair company. It's kind of big shoot for me, and I was excited by it. I said, you know, this would be a good time to upgrade my camera. I want to really produce a file that looks amazing. And I've been shooting with the Nikon D800 for the past, I guess, 7 years or so. I said, now's a good time to move to like a D800 or a D800E or a D810. So I do a little bit of reading up on the three cameras, and I realized that the D800 is going to be just fine, particularly since I tend to be shooting at like f8 or 5.6 in the studio. So the advantage of the D800E is going to be minimal, and don't really need the D810 for $3,000. Let me get the D800 now, and in a year or so when they come out with the next Pro body, I'll buy that, because I never liked the fact that the D800 is that kind of half-size body. It's not like a D3X where it's a large full body with the built-in vertical release. So, okay, I buy a D800, get a great deal, $1,300 for the camera, 3 batteries, and the grip. Really good price. Get the D800, do some testing. The file looks like garbage. I'm shocked because everything I've read says something different, but to my eyes, the file doesn't look good. It's like fuzzy, looks a little bit like sort of out of focus or whatever. So of course I go to Facebook and I'm like, oh, this is the worst camera ever, because I'm not one to do extensive testing before I start doing my rant. You know, I'm going to just throw out an opinion out there, of course. So I'm like, oh yeah, the camera's garbage, I'm going to sell it. So I put it up for sale. In the time that the camera is up for sale on eBay, it's like a 7-day auction, I start messing around with it again, and I realized that the file is actually really good. I had made 2 mistakes in my initial assessment of the file. For one thing, I was looking at the JPEG and not the RAW file. And I know to a lot of people that probably sounds crazy because everybody's so big on RAW. But the truth of the matter is, if you're shooting in a studio situation where you have really sat there for 10, 15 minutes tweaking the lights to perfection, and you've made sure you've lit the hair and you've lit the face and you've got a soft modifier and you've been in the same location like I have for 10 years and using the same camera for 7 years, and you even know what Kelvin number to dial in on the camera, because you know from trial and error and experience, you know how to make it look the colors that you want. There's very little adjusting that you're doing that requires a RAW file. If I'm just going to retouch it, I can do it right off the JPEG. It looks fine. And I know that's sacrilege to people, but JPEGs out of my D3X look amazing, and like I say, there's very little adjusting that I need to do to them in a studio shoot. So I had done my testing on the D800 looking at the JPEG file. However, on that camera, when I look at the RAW file as compared to the JPEG, there was a dramatic difference in sharpening. And I actually had to apply a little bit of sharpening settings, at which point the D800 file looked really good. The other mistake was I was using my 24-70, which I use quite often in the studio at 70 millimeters. And that lens looks terrible on my D800. Not sure why. Maybe it's like a focus calibration thing. I never do that autofocus calibration, so I don't know. But that lens is just garbage on the D800. But when I put my 85 millimeter 1.4, the file looked phenomenal. So I go, man, this looks really good. I'm going to keep the D800. I'm going to keep it. So I kill the auction. I keep the D800. During this like little week that it was up, all of a sudden I see online that the D810 has now dropped in price to $2,100 for the gray market version. So I go, you know, it actually makes more sense to pick up the 810 for $2,100 than the D800 for essentially $1,000, because the 810 goes to ISO 64, supposed to give you slightly better tonal range. It's only double the price. It's not that big of a deal. $3,000, you know, maybe I don't want to get it. $2,100, it's a no-brainer. I'm going to get it. I don't care if it's gray market. It's not going to break anyway. I'm good to go. I'm going to like slam it into a wall before it gets any kind of like breaking that would be under USA warranty. Like my kind of breaking, I'm going to drop it down a flight of stairs, you know. But anyway, so I get the D810, which, where is it? If you're watching this on video, by the way, this is the D810. I'm holding it up now, right? So I get the D810. So now I've got the two cameras that I'm supposed to sell the D800. And I'm thinking like, well, maybe I should just keep the D800 as a backup. If I'm on a shoot, something goes wrong, you know, I can just whip out the D800 instead of the 810. But boy, as I started shooting with this D810, I've grown to like it and not love it yet. I've definitely grown to like it. I'm getting used to like the controls. Certain things are like not where I'm used to them being. Like the ISO is in a different place for my D3X. And I had to set my lock button to a different place to lock my shutter and aperture, which I do all the time. Now it's on like one of these little FN buttons. I have it on the FV button on the, what I'm not even sure what that says. My eyes aren't good enough to read it on a camera now, but I don't know. It's one of those buttons on the front of the camera, so I'm kind of getting used to my shutter and aperture lock being on the front of the camera instead of where it was on the D3X. But I'm starting to like it, but I started liking it to the point that I said, you know, I'm not going to keep the D800 anymore. I'll just go without a backup or use the Leica M240 as a like sort of backup, even though it can't do everything that the D810 does. But if I get a backup, I'm going to buy another D810. I don't want a D800 at this point. The autofocus is a little better on the D810, and the shutter just feels so different. Like when you hear the shutter on the 810, it just sounds better. Like this is the D810 shutter. It's like a soft cushioned sound. And then this is the D800 shutter. You know, it's like a slap. So I didn't like the D800. So as of right now, at the time I'm recording this podcast, this D800 is actually on eBay right now. I put it up at $900 starting price. I'm confident it's going to go for $1,000, and I'm going to actually end up like making like $50 on the buying and selling of the camera. But I do think, in all honesty, the best deal, if money is your object, money's your concern, D800 used is the best deal out there, because nobody wants the D800. Everybody thinks the D800E produces a better file. But if you're like me and you're shooting in a studio at like a 5.6 or an f8 and you've got the right lens, everything I've read online suggests you are not going to see a difference. Where you're really going to see a difference between the D800 and the D800E is going to be at like f2, 1.4, you know, maybe 1.8. Those situations, for some reason, you'll see more of a difference, but you're not really going to see it at f8 once you put a little sharpening on it. So D800's a great deal. I felt, for me professionally, D810 was the better choice for me personally. That doesn't mean that's what I would recommend to everyone else. So in any event, at this exact moment, I own a D800 and a D810, but the D800 is on eBay, and I'm getting rid of that. So the next piece of gear buying on this little month of buying gear, which also included buying a Zoom recorder, the new, I got the H5. I needed that for a job, so I ran out and bought that. And the next thing I bought, though, was I ended up getting booked for 2 weeks of shooting on a TV production set for 2 weeks, and they said I needed a silent camera. And we're in such a good time now that it's not like the old days where, you know, you have to go buy a blimp for like $1,000 and you've got your camera in this really awkward blimp that looks like a shoebox, and you're trying to look through a little viewfinder and the shutter button's in the wrong place. We're in a different time now. There's like 5 or 6 completely silent cameras now. You can get a Nikon V1 or a J1. Fuji makes at least 2 cameras. I think it's the XE2S and the X Pro 2. I believe those, at least, and some of their other cameras, are silent. The Sony A7S II, completely silent. They have a mode that you can turn on completely silent. And even the A6300 completely silent. Now, I own an A6000, which I got at a really good price on this Fred Miranda forum, probably like $350 or something. It's really low. And I mean, great image quality. It doesn't weigh anything. It's nice to carry around. And I shoot some jiu-jitsu pictures with it sometimes because the autofocus is good on it. But my God, you could not design a camera worse than this. It's like if you have to change a setting, you just cannot find it. It's impossible to find. And the fact that this particular camera doesn't have a front control dial, like where your index finger would be, makes it very difficult because you have a dial where your thumb goes and another dial that's kind of like a clock. It's kind of like a flat circular dial that you can use to, like, you could set one to shutter and one to aperture. But every time you're changing one of those, the lower back one, I'm not sure what it's called, the circular one. Every time you go to change it, the one I'm touching now, if you're watching this on YouTube, every time you go to change it, you have to kind of pull the camera away from your face. So it's not very, I don't know, it doesn't work good while you're actually shooting as you're trying to change your shutter and your aperture. And that back dial where I keep my aperture, don't you love New York? Look at the sounds of New York in the background. It is so cool. But that little back dial where I have my aperture, I'm constantly changing it by mistake. Every time I'm just hanging a camera on my shoulder, that little dial is bumping into my waist and I change the dial. So the good thing about the camera, they do give you a couple of like function buttons, and that's good because you can program those as you want. But in any event, so I bought this A6300 for like $1,000 just because it has a completely silent shutter. Now, as I expected when I got to the set, the A6000 shutter would have been fine because it's so quiet. Like, no one's ever going to hear this. I'm 10, 15 feet away from the camera. The host of the show is wearing a lav microphone. Like, that's not going to pick up my shutter sound. But anyway, you make people happy. You're like, yeah, my camera's silent, and they're happy. So I was glad to have it, even though technically I didn't really need a 100% silent shutter. But it's funny, so I'm on the set and I'm shooting with the two of them, the A6300 and the A6000. I've got a lens that's like a 70 to 300. I got it for $220 on Amazon, and I already had what I don't even know what it is. It's like a 16 to 55. It's kind of like a 24 to 70 lens. And on one of the two cameras, my shutter is on one dial and the aperture is on the other dial. And then on the other body, the aperture is on that dial and the shutter is on the other one. And I mean, I sat there at this set for like 10 or 12 minutes trying to figure out where that setting was so I could make the two cameras match, because it was driving me crazy. Every time I tried to change shutter or aperture, I was turning the wrong dial because the two cameras didn't match. I'd get used to it on one camera, pick up the other camera, and I couldn't work seamlessly. But like, I could not find where that was. How am I setting where in the menu is that setting? I mean, it's just such a poorly designed camera. And what I would say to anyone who's using like a Sony A6000 or an A6300 or even the A7, if for some reason you believe that photography or working the camera is a really complicated, confusing thing, you really should look at some other brands and just understand that like photography is not as complicated as that Sony camera would make it seem. There's a thing you could turn on this camera, like the 6300 or the 6000, and you can touch the display button, and I mean, you're gonna get a list of like settings that you're on that would just blow your mind. Like, there's so much information about like, I don't know, like metering modes and camera shake and eye start activation and like just so many pieces of information that show up on the screen, and it's absolutely ridiculous. Like, and I'm looking at it right now, like there's a histogram there, that 3-colored histogram. It's like white, red, blue, and green or whatever. I mean, I don't use a histogram at all. I mean, for me, that's not what photography is about, particularly not in 2016 when if you shoot a raw file, you have so much exposure latitude. You can be off a tiny bit on the exposure, especially if you're doing like me, and what you're really focused on is like, what am I shooting? I'm not 100% focused on like, am I on 5.6 or 6.3? That's kind of irrelevant sometimes when you're shooting a raw file at a low ISO. It's way more important, like, what am I shooting? What's the composition? And if it's a person, which is like 95% of what I shoot, probably 99% is people, it's like the interaction with the person. Is he or she comfortable? Am I catching the right expression on the face? That's what I'm thinking about. The histogram is like just completely irrelevant to me. But the amount of information that you get on the back of one of these cameras is like, it's stunning. And you could be thinking like, well, you know, like I'm not good at photography, or I don't understand photography, or it's so complicated. And maybe it's really just because you're using one of these Sonys that just makes it seem more complicated than it needs to be because of how many features they give you. In reality, it all comes down to shutter, aperture, ISO, and maybe white balance. And I say maybe white balance because you can change white balance if you shoot RAW. So then it really just comes down to ISO, shutter, and aperture. That's all that really matters. Autofocus modes and you know, the drive, continuous shooting, none of that really matters. It just doesn't really matter as much as those three. You just need to be able to access those three. And I say it probably on every podcast, but it's one of the reasons that I love my Leica so much is that those controls are super easy to access. I've got a dial for aperture, a dial for shutter, and a button for ISO. So the things that really matter are right where I need them on my M240 and on my M9. And those are still to this day my favorite cameras. And you're talking to someone right now who owns a Nikon D3, a Nikon D3S, a D800, which is up for sale, a D810, a Sony A6000, and a Sony A6300. And my favorite cameras are still the Leica M9 and the Leica M240, okay? But I will say the image quality on that D810 at ISO 64 in a studio setting is absolutely stunning to me. So, if you don't, you know, if you're willing to roll the dice like me and use a gray market camera, man, $2,100 on eBay, brand new, is an insane deal. So eventually I might get two, so I have a backup. I'm not sure yet. I want to talk about one last thing in the category of gear. So I shoot on white seamless a lot. And it's funny, but for years I've always had a problem where I get like a little bit of flare coming from the white background, okay? So this may be a little confusing to explain in an audio format without a visual aid, but try to bear with me, okay? So if you're shooting on white seamless, normally what you do is you take some lights and you point them at the background, and then you take a different set of lights and you point them at the subject. If you do it properly, your background lights do not hit the subject, and the background lights make the background white. And then you put some different lights on your subject and you light the subject properly, and you should have a white background with a person properly lit. Now, if you do it wrong, and let's say you put too much power on your backlights, what happens is you get like a lens flare. There's light kind of bleeding onto the person from the background lights, and it makes the picture kind of cloudy. Now, for all the years I've been in my studio, we have never managed to really get it perfectly right. Like our white background is good, but there's always a little bit more spillover onto the person than I would like. And I've tried a lot of different things. We lower the power of the background lights. We use different light modifiers for the background. We use different ways of flagging off the background lights so they don't hit the person from the front. We've done a lot of different things to try to avoid the background lights sort of flaring into the lens. Now, it's not a huge problem in Lightroom. You know, you can just kind of increase the contrast or increase the black level, and a client can't really tell the difference. But it's something that, like, I'm aware it's not 100% perfect, not 100% the way I would like it to be. So it's always bothered me. But anyway, because I have this kind of big shoot coming up, I said, you know, I'm going to solve the problem. Like, I am going to solve this problem that has been bothering me for years with that little bit of flare coming from the background. Started reading everything I could on the internet. I read the Zach Arias one, which I'd read years ago. Great tutorial. Zach Arias did one about like how to shoot on a white background. That was where we got the idea of using the tile board on the floor. We've been using that ever since I read that tutorial years ago. We used white tile board on the floor. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look for the Zach Arias piece on white seamless. You put that on the floor, it makes your background paper last forever because you can wash the tile board when it gets dirty. Whereas if you let people walk on the white seamless paper, once it gets dirty, you have to throw it away. But the tile board, man, you use it for like 6 to 8 months before it becomes unusable. And it gives you a little bit of a reflection from the bottom, and I like that look. It looks a little bit like a mirror when they stand on it, and that's a look that I like. So I love it, and I thank Zach for having posted that information because that's where we found out about that. But in any event, I read all of this stuff, and I notice that when people are, and everybody's just giving me the same information I know already, and that's a problem that I get, period, when I look at instructional content in photography, and I know this may sound obnoxious, but I've been doing this a long time. I know a lot about lighting, I know a lot about photography. I don't know it all, no one does, but I know quite a bit. And a lot of times if I watch a video and someone's like, tips for beauty lighting or something, I'll click it, and it's all stuff I know already. It's stuff I'm doing or stuff I did and I don't even do anymore for whatever reason. I've just dropped it from my toolkit or whatever. But a lot of times I don't find information because, again, I've been in the same studio for 10 years, been full-time at this now 16 years. So a lot of times it's stuff I know. So as I'm reading all these tutorials and looking at any tutorials I could find, I'm going like, what is the missing link? Why am I always getting this little bit of flare behind? I noticed that one of the things that's being mentioned in these pieces is it says experiment with different lenses because different lenses handle the flare differently. Now this was something I was kind of aware of because like my Leica 70 millimeter or 75 millimeter, whatever it is, Sumerit, the 2.5 version, that flares more than my Nikon, and my 85 millimeter 1.4D flares more than my 24 to 70. I was aware of it, but I hadn't really given it that much thought. And this time, that night, I sat and gave that a lot of thought. I said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to try every single 85 millimeter lens made for Nikon until I find the one that flares the least and see if that solves the problem. So I started off with the Nikon 85 millimeter 1.4G, which is the new version of my lens, because I've got the D version. Mine's about 20 years old. And start shooting with that lens. And instantly, the flare problem is gone. Instantly. I see an instant difference in how the two lenses handle the flare. Even to the point I showed it to the model. I asked her, like, which one do you like better? She picked the G version. I asked her to explain it, and she doesn't have the vocabulary to explain it properly in terms of like photography technical terms. But what she's saying is it looks cloudy. This one looks fuzzy. She sees the difference right away. So I solved the problem, a problem that's been bothering me for years. Again, not a huge problem because we've been kind of doing a workaround, increase the contrast, increase the blacks a little, client can't tell, but it's always something that bothered me a little because I could tell that it was a little bit off. But I solved it, 85 millimeter 1.4 G version of the lens. So I immediately put my 85 1.4, which I'm holding up to the camera now if you're watching a YouTube version of the podcast. I put mine on eBay. I put it up for $380, which is an insanely good price. I mean, it's an auction, so I'm not sure what it's going to go for. But that's a great price because at 1.4, the two lenses are identical. I mean, basically identical. I shot them side by side with the D800. They both, you don't get a better hit rate in terms of autofocus with either lens. At 1.4, the depth of field is so shallow, and you're moving a little, and she's moving a little, and the camera's focusing off a little bit. You have to shoot 10 or 15 shots to get one that's sharp exactly where you need it at 1.4. And that was true of the D version and the G version of the lens. The G version focuses faster, but for me, it doesn't focus more accurately. So they're almost the same. And if money were a concern for you, the 85 millimeter 1.4D is a better deal money-wise. Buying that used is a better deal than buying the new version for like $1,500. I got lucky and got the new version for $1,100 on the Fred Miranda forum. Well, I'm saying lucky, it hasn't arrived yet. Assuming it arrives in the mail next week and it's as the person described it, then I got lucky. But we don't know yet because I didn't actually get it yet. But so I put that up. So bottom line is, if you're having that issue that I had, which is this bit of flare coming into your pictures when you're trying to shoot on a white background, really take the time and experiment with a variety of different lenses. And I was going to try them all, meaning I was going to try like a $200 Rokinon lens because at f8 that lens is probably killer. So I wasn't even going to just start with, it wasn't going to only look at the top brands, the Sigma or whatever. I was going to look at all of them until I found one that reduced that flare. But if you're kind of getting that problem, pay a little attention to what lens you're using. I think for me, at least in those tutorials, that was something that was mentioned, but it'd be like half a sentence or one sentence. They spent way more time talking about like the measurement of the distance of the background lights to the paper and how to flag off the lights and whether you use an umbrella for the background lights or whether you do like a crisscross pattern, and it was all these things about the background lights and flagging the lights. And for me, I was doing all of that right from day one. The issue for me really was I was using a lens that just tended to flare a little more than I wanted it to flare, and I was able to solve the problem by just using a lens that handled that flare better. So my problem is solved. I'm super excited. But anyway, that's like my monthly recap. My month ended up seeing me purchase a Nikon D800, D810, a Nikon 85mm 1.4G, a Sony A6300, and the equivalent lens of like a 70 to 300 for the Sony, and a Zoom H5 recorder, because the Tascam that I'm using now has an XLR cable permanently stuck in it that I can't pull out of it. It's like useless. It's the, I don't even know what in the model this is. DR 100 something 2 it is. And there's a permanent XLR cable stuck in the back. So I'm using it for the podcast because I can use that XLR cable into a microphone, but I can't use it for the other things that I would use a portable recorder for. So that Tascam is all but useless to me. But I bought a Zoom H5, which is a fantastic device. Love that device. I love the size of it. The battery life is great. It works phenomenally. Like it much better than a Tascam. But again, I bought a lot of stuff this month. Hopefully I'm done, and hopefully there won't be any more purchases. But again, I do have a few pieces for sale on eBay, so hopefully I'll get some of the money back that I've spent, or book enough jobs to make it all worthwhile. But I feel kind of guilty buying all this stuff. Anyway, that's Camera Work Podcast. If you want to find me, Instagram is the best place. It's John Ricard on Instagram, JOHNRICARD. Definitely let me know what you want to hear about on the podcast, so we can make sure the podcast, is what you want it to be. All right. Thanks for listening, guys. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.